Imagine a film industry that releases, well, 7 new feature films every single day.
Yeah, it's a massive number.
Right. I mean, we are talking about thousands of movies a year, and
Hmm.
these are watched by hundreds of millions of people across an entire continent, and now by this huge diaspora around the globe.
Which is just incredible to think about.
It really is. But here is the catch for you. This industry is entirely independent of Hollywood. It wasn't born in those perfectly manicured studio lots in California, and it wasn't funded by some massive corporate conglomerate with endless credit lines.
Not at all.
It was born out of absolute crushing necessity, right in the middle of a national economic collapse. You basically grab a camera, you gather your unemployed friends, and you just start shooting. Purely because the formal systems around you have completely failed, and, well, you still have stories to tell.
It's a phenomenal image, isn't it? And it completely upends everything we are traditionally taught in film school about how a massive media empire is supposed to be built.
Oh, for sure.
I mean, we tend to think of global cinema as this highly formalized, impossibly expensive gated community. You think you need permits, you need unions, you need millions of dollars in backing just to start.
Right. You need the green light from an executive.
Exactly.
Yeah.
But the story of the Nigerian film industry proves the exact opposite. It's really the ultimate triumph of the informal economy.
Exactly. And that is exactly what we are diving into today. We are going deep into the creation, the wild evolution, and just the staggering scale of Nollywood.
It's going to be a fascinating ride.
It is. We are using Jonathan Haynes' incredibly comprehensive book, Nollywood, The Creation of Nigerian Film Genres, as our roadmap for this deep dive. Our goal here is to chart exactly how a makeshift, straight-to-video hustle evolved. I mean, we are talking about movies literally sold out of the trunks of cars and in chaotic market stalls.
Which is how it all started.
Right. And we want to see how that evolved into a global cinematic powerhouse. We are going to explore the specific genres they invented just to survive, the really chaotic cash-in-hand economics that funded them, and the deep cultural psychology that fueled their rise.
And just to put the sheer scale of this into context for you, let's look at the numbers, because they are genuinely staggering.
Lay it on us.
Okay, so between 1970 and 1992, the entire country of Nigeria produced about 100 feature films on traditional celluloid.
Wow. Only 100.
Yeah, just 100 over 2 whole decades. But then you fast forward to the year 2010, and the National Censorship Board had registered over 14,000 video films.
Wait, 14,000?
14,000. It is a complete explosion of content. And this is totally different from the model we saw in, say, Francophone Africa.
How so?
Well, in places like Senegal or Mali, cinema was often highly intellectual. It was very elite, heavily funded by European cultural grants, and frankly, it was rarely actually seen by everyday African audiences because there was no real distribution network.
Oh.
Right. But the Nigerian reality was the total inverse of that. It was deeply commercial, wildly popular, and just completely unapologetically homegrown.
I love that. Okay, let's unpack this. Because if you've ever felt overwhelmed by the sheer scale of global media, or if you think you need a massive budget to create something culturally shifting, this story proves that sometimes the most powerful art comes from simply hacking the system.
It really does.
So to really understand how this happened, we have to go back to the early 1990s. We have to set the stage, and I'll be honest, the stage is bleak. We are talking about the era of the Structural Adjustment Program, or SAP. This spanned the 1980s and 90s.
A very tough time.
Yeah. Now, you read about SAP in economics textbooks, but what did that actually look like on the ground in a city like Lagos?
It was a time of profound traumatic crisis. To truly grasp the birth of Nollywood, you really have to picture Lagos during this era.
Paint the picture for us.
Well, the structural adjustment policies were mandated by international financial institutions like the IMF and the World Bank. The goal was ostensibly to manage Nigeria's massive debt.
Right, the official line.
Exactly. But the immediate reality for people was that they demanded the radical devaluation of the national currency, the naira. They mandated the privatization of public enterprises and just these massive sweeping cuts to government spending.
So the safety net just vanishes.
Completely vanishes. The formal economy cratered. Industrial production ground to a halt. You had civil servants, teachers, police officers. They suddenly found that their salaries, which used to afford them a really solid middle-class life, couldn't even buy basic groceries.
That is terrifying.
It was. Or worse, they weren't being paid at all for months at a time. The infrastructure just began to fail on every level. Electricity became so incredibly erratic that the roar of thousands of private diesel-chucking generators became the permanent background noise of the city.
Wow. And when you have that level of sheer economic desperation, the social fabric has to start tearing, right?
Yeah. Oh, absolutely. Violent street crime skyrocketed. Armed robbery became a terrifying, everyday reality for people.
So people probably just stopped going out.
They literally stopped going out at night. The old celluloid cinema houses, which used to be these beautiful, bustling hubs of entertainment in the 70s, they just decayed. They became genuinely dangerous places to be after dark.
And I imagine making traditional movies became impossible too.
Completely. Because shooting on actual celluloid film stock required hard foreign currency to import the film,
Yeah.
and then you had to ship it to places like London for processing. It became impossibly expensive for local filmmakers.
Well, the professional industry just stops.
It essentially became paralyzed.
Yeah.
It ground to an absolute halt by 1992.
And this is the crucial ingredient here. Nigeria had something else bubbling right under the surface, didn't it?
Yes, it did. It had the Nigerian Television Authority, the NTA.
Right, the NTA.
The NTA was this massive unifying national force. By 1984, they had an estimated 30 million viewers tuning in every single night.
30 million, that's huge.
It's a massive reach. They were producing wildly popular local television serials. These rivaled things like The Cosby Show or Dynasty in terms of their absolute grip on the local audience.
Oh, wow.
And importantly, they had trained a massive generation of professionals, actors, directors, writers, technicians, especially through these legendary, really intensive training workshops they ran in the mid-1980s.
But then, just like everything else, the NTA gets hit by the SAP crisis,
Yeah,
right?
exactly. Budget cuts freeze all the hiring. The production quality inevitably drops. And then the administration introduces these truly bizarre, self-defeating policies.
Like what?
Well, like suddenly banning their own employees from moonlighting.
Right.
Or even acting in the very serials they were producing.
Wait, what? They couldn't act in their own shows?
No, it was considered private practice. So you have all these highly trained, incredibly talented people who know exactly how to tell a compelling story, and they're suddenly out of work. Or their salaries are totally worthless, and you're desperately looking for a way to survive.
Okay, so colliding with that hungry, unemployed talent pool is what the book calls an infrastructure of piracy.
Yes.
Because during the oil boom of the 1970s and early 80s, before the whole crash, the Nigerian middle class had imported an enormous amount of VCRs.
Huge amounts.
There were VCRs in millions of homes. And when the cinemas became too dangerous, this massive informal economy springs up to service those VCRs in the safety of people's living rooms.
Precisely. You had businessmen importing blank VHS tapes by the shipping container. And they set up these literal factories in back rooms. Just banks and banks of VCRs wired together.
Just copying tapes all day.
All day and all night. Pirating foreign Hollywood action movies, Chinese martial arts films, massive, massive amounts of Bollywood musicals. And they distributed these pirated tapes through vast, totally unregulated networks of electronic shops and street peddlers.
Okay, wait, let me make sure I have this ecosystem straight.
Go.
You have millions of VCRs already sitting in people's living rooms. You have a highly trained television workforce wandering the streets without jobs. You have these massive underground syndicates capable of duplicating and distributing millions of VHS tapes in a matter of days.
Right.
And you have a population that is too terrified of armed robbery to leave their houses for entertainment.
That is the exact setup.
So all the kindling is perfectly stacked, and the spark that lights the fire happens in 1992. It's a film called Living in Bondage, and it brings together three fascinating figures who essentially invent the Nollywood industry overnight.
Yes. The trio behind Living in Bondage perfectly represents those three distinct forces coming together.
Let's break them down.
First, you have Kenneth Nibiu. He was a major player in that infrastructure of piracy we just mentioned.
The guy with the blank tapes.
Exactly. He was an Igbo businessman, an electronics dealer based out of Lagos, who imported blank cassettes from Taiwan. He understood the distribution market intimately, he had the liquid capital, and he had the network to move the product.
Okay, so he's the money and distribution. Who is the creative?
Then you have Oki Ogunjiofor. He's this brilliant, ambitious, recently graduated student from the NTA's television training program.
But he can't get a job because of the hiring freeze.
Exactly. He is literally reduced to hawking goods on the street just to survive. He happens to stumble across some actors rehearsing under the trees near the National Arts Theater in Lagos. He starts giving them directorial advice and gets pulled into their network.
So he brings the script.
Right. He provides the core story for the film, drawing really heavily on the dark rumors and anxieties he'd observed circulating in the desperate city streets.
And the third guy?
The third figure is Chris Obiropu. He was a highly established, powerful director at the NTA. He knew exactly how to block a scene, how to light for video, how to get performances out of actors.
But wait, didn't you say the NTA banned their directors from doing outside work?
They did. Because of those strict NTA rules against moonlighting, he actually had to direct the film in secret. He used the pseudonym Vic Morty, which was his wife's maiden name.
That is incredible. So you have the marketer with the cash, the hungry young creative with the script, and the seasoned television veteran with the technical know-how.
The perfect storm.
And what they create together isn't just a simple home video. Living in Bondage is this massive, sprawling 5.5-hour epic, and it's split into 2 VHS cassettes.
It was huge.
And the absolute genius of Kenneth Enebu was in the packaging. Look, it wasn't the very first thing ever shot on video in Nigeria. I know there were Yoruba theater troupes taping their stage plays before this.
Right, the theater groups were already doing that.
But Nenebu took this VHS tape, put it in a full-color, glossy cardboard jacket, shrink-wrapped it, and put a slick montage of recognizable TV stars right on the cover.
It was all about the presentation.
He made it look exactly like an imported Hollywood blockbuster you'd rent from a video store. He pumped it into his distribution network, and it just exploded. It sold hundreds of thousands of copies purely through word of mouth.
What's fascinating here is the actual story they chose to tell, because it established the absolute thematic core of Nollywood for years to come.
The money ritual.
Yes. Living in Bondage is the prototype for what became known as the money ritual film. The plot centers on a man named Andy, who is deeply frustrated by his lack of wealth and status in this collapsing economy.
Which everyone watching could relate to.
Exactly. So he gets drawn into a secretive satanic cult made up of these seemingly respectable, ultra-rich businessmen. And to achieve his wealth, he is forced by the cult to ritually sacrifice the person he loves most.
Oh, no.
Yeah, his completely innocent, devoted wife, Merritt. She is killed, he gets incredibly rich and starts throwing massive parties. But her ghost begins to haunt him relentlessly until he loses his mind. He ends up wandering the streets in rags and is finally saved by a Pentecostal pastor.
Okay, wait. Let's really pause on this because this is wild to me.
It's intense.
They took this incredibly heavy, traumatic national economic crisis, this total systemic collapse of the Nayara, where people are literally losing their life savings, and they processed it by turning it into a supernatural soap opera.
They really did.
That's like processing the 2008 global financial crash by making a movie where Wall Street bankers are literal blood-sucking vampires extracting life force from the middle class.
That is an absolutely perfect analogy, because the money ritual wasn't just cheap horror or, B-movie schlock. It was a razor-sharp, deeply felt socioeconomic critique.
Explain that a bit more.
We have to remember the context. This was the era of a brazen military kleptocracy under General Ibrahim Babangida. Ordinary people were starving. They were scraping by on nothing. Yet they would look up and see these military officers and their civilian cronies driving imported Mercedes-Benzes.
Throwing lavish parties and all that.
Yes. Displaying this inexplicable, sudden, massive wealth. In a society where the formal avenues to success, like hard work, education, a civil service job, where all those were totally blocked, that kind of hyperwealth felt unnatural. It felt wicked.
So they blamed the occult?
Exactly. The occult served as a very literal, very visceral metaphor for predatory capitalism. The film was basically screaming at the audience that this wealth you see around you is built on the blood of the innocent.
That makes so much sense.
It was a way for the popular audience to process, understand, and ultimately condemn the intense systemic corruption going on around them.
It gave a face and a mechanism to the invisible macroeconomic forces that were tearing their lives apart. It's brilliant. But of course, because this is the film business, as soon as Living in Bondage proves there is millions of naira to be made in this new medium, the founding trio immediately fractured.
Naturally, it was the very first instance of the turbulent, often toxic relationships that would come to define the Nollywood business model.
Money ruins everything.
Always. There was this constant, grinding tension between the marketers who controlled the money and distribution and the creatives who actually made the art. Ogunjiofor and Obirapu felt they were cheated out of the massive windfall profits by Nebu.
Could they do anything about it?
Not really.
Yeah.
Because the industry was entirely informal, they didn't have ironclad written contracts, so they couldn't sue. They simply walked away in anger.
But that anger was incredibly productive, wasn't it? It sent them out into the city to build their own production companies. It was like a seed pod bursting open.
A great way to put it.
Suddenly, everyone involved in that first film, the actors, the cameramen, the writers, they are all scrambling to replicate the success, and they end up building an entire industry based on this brand new template. Which brings us to a massive structural shift in how these movies were made and who they were made for.
Right. Because Living in Bondage and the immediate wave of films that followed were shot in the Igbo language.
Which makes sense based on who was making them.
Exactly. It made sense because they were funded and distributed heavily through Igbo-dominated merchant networks,
Yeah.
particularly the massive labyrinthine Idamoda market in Lagos. But in 1994, Kenneth Nebu made another incredibly calculated, pivotal move.
What did he do?
He produced and released a film called Glamour Girls. And crucially, Glamour Girls was shot in English.
Now, why does that matter so much? Because Nigeria is incredibly diverse. It has over 250 distinct ethnic groups.
Yes, it does.
By making the film in English or in Nigerian pidgin, suddenly you aren't just selling to the Igbo market in the east or in specific Lagos neighborhoods. You are opening up a massive national market.
It changes everything.
You are allowing Yoruba, Hausa, Edo, and Efik audiences to watch, to understand, and to eventually participate in making their own films in this format.
Exactly.
And looking down the road, this choice of English is exactly what allows Nollywood to cross borders and dominate the entire African continent and eventually the global diaspora.
It was an absolute masterstroke of market expansion. And Glamour Girls didn't just change the linguistic landscape. It cemented a brand new, highly controversial genre.
The senior girl.
Yes, the senior girl archetype. In the crushing SAP economy where traditional male providers were failing, the film focused on independent, ruthless, hyper-glamorous career women.
I bet that rustled some feathers.
Oh, it did. In many of these plots, they were essentially high-end prostitutes or mistresses. And they were surviving and thriving by using their bodies, their fashion, and their razor-sharp wits to extract wealth from corrupt big men and politicians.
Wow.
It was scandalous. It was heavily debated in newspapers. But it addressed the rapidly shifting gender and power dynamics of the city head-on.
Okay, I have to jump in here because I'm struggling to understand the demographic math on this one.
Sure, what's the hang-up?
I know that in Nollywood, the industry openly acknowledges that women make up roughly 80% of the audience. The films are primarily consumed in the home, right? On the TV, in the living room, often with the family around.
Yes, very communal viewing.
So if the audience is largely watching in conservative, family-oriented settings, why were they eating up these incredibly scandalous, morally ambiguous movies about ruthless, hyper-glamorous sex workers?
That's a brilliant question. And it really gets to the core of why these films worked. The appeal of the senior girl films wasn't just titillation. It was about power.
Power, okay.
Think about it. For a female audience trapped in a highly patriarchal society that was simultaneously undergoing intense economic stress, watching a woman outsmart, manipulate, and financially drain a corrupt, powerful man was incredibly cathartic.
Like a fantasy of agency.
Exactly. It was a fantasy of agency. But importantly, because of the strict moral codes of the society, these films almost always ended with the senior girl facing some kind of tragic downfall or repenting.
Ah, so there is a catch.
Right. So the audience got to enjoy the thrilling transgression of the fantasy, but still have their conservative moral universe restored by the end credits.
Ah, so it's a have your cake and eat it too situation.
Yeah.
You get the glamorous outfits and the power plays, but you also get the moral lesson.
It's exact.
But that wasn't the only genre catering to women, right? Running parallel to those scandalous urban films was the absolute bedrock of the industry, the family melodrama.
Yes. The family melodrama was the foundational genre. These were films that looked inward, focusing intensely on domestic conflicts. They dealt with massive, deeply felt cultural anxieties.
Like what sort of anxiety?
Things like the intense societal pressure around fertility, the devastating social and familial consequences of a woman not bearing children, and the famously overbearing influence of in-laws interfering in a marriage, often trying to drive out a wife they didn't approve of.
And this demographic power naturally gave rise to incredibly powerful female creators, didn't it? If 80% of the audience is women wanting stories about domestic life, you need women to tell them authentically.
Exactly. This era saw the rise of absolute titans in the industry.
Who are the big names?
Women like Amaka Igwe. She'd created legendary, sophisticated TV serials back in the NTA days and transitioned smoothly to video. She brought a much higher level of psychological realism to the genre.
An MMI song too, right?
Yes, Imo Song. She started as a screenwriter and became a powerhouse producer. She was known for pushing boundaries and focusing heavily on female desire and emotional complexity.
They were changing the narrative.
They really were.
Yeah.
They steered the narratives toward the ideal of companionate marriage, the idea that a husband and wife should be a team against the world, rather than the wife being subjugated to the husband's extended family. They were subtly rewriting the social contract through these melodramas.
I love how deeply sociological this gets, but I want to pivot to the actual physical mechanics of how these films are getting made, because honestly, it sounds like absolute chaos.
Oh, it was pure chaos.
We're talking about a completely informal business model. I read about marketers from the Idimoto market literally pulling 10 million naira, which was roughly 65,000 US dollars at the time, in pure cash out of these woven plastic bags.
Yes, the famous Ghana Must Go bags.
Right. And just for you listeners, those bags have a wild history of their own. They are these cheap, woven, plaid plastic bags that got their name in 1983. The Nigerian government suddenly expelled over 2 million undocumented West African migrants, mostly Ghanaians, and they all packed their belongings into these specific bags to flee.
A very dark origin for the name.
It is. But in the 90s, they became the ultimate symbol of bulk cash in the informal economy. So a marketer brings a Ghana Must Go bag full of cash to a director. What happens next?
What happens next is a frantic, adrenaline-fueled sprint. The marketer hands over the cash, and the movie has to be cast, shot, edited, duplicated, and sitting in the market stalls within weeks, sometimes even days.
Days. That's insane.
Speed was a matter of sheer existential survival. The biggest threat to Nollywood from day one, ironically considering its roots, was piracy.
Right. The pirates were waiting.
If you had a hit movie, you had a window of maybe 1 or 2 weeks to sell your legitimate copies before the pirates duplicated it, undercut your price, and flooded the market with cheap knockoffs.
So you couldn't take your time.
Not at all. So the capital had to spin constantly. You shoot fast, you sell fast, you take the cash from the first week's sales, and you immediately fund the next movie.
It's like the early Hollywood studio system of the 1920s, but on fast forward and fueled by Red Bull. And navigating this rapid-fire environment were incredibly prolific groups like the Isoko Mafia.
Yes. The Isoko are a smaller ethnic group from the Niger Delta region. But figures from that community, like Zeb Ejiro and his brother Chico Ejiro, completely dominated the production landscape in the mid to late 90s.
Chico Ejiro was known as Mr. Prolific, wasn't he?
He literally earned that nickname for the staggering, almost unbelievable volume of films he directed. They pumped out these highly cosmopolitan, trans-ethnic, urban Lagos films.
Like Domitilla.
Yes, Zeb Ejiro's Domitilla in 1996. It was about a young woman pushed into prostitution just to survive the harsh city. It was a massive cultural event. It coined catchphrases that everyone in the country was using. They were churning out stories of urban survival, violent crime, and high society at breakneck speed.
Okay, I have to push back here. I understand the economic necessity of moving that fast. But if you're churning out movies week after week, all set in the exact same rented Lagos mansions, dealing with the same urban struggles, the same prostitutes, the same corrupt bankers, isn't there a huge risk of creative exhaustion? Don't the audiences eventually just get bored of seeing the exact same living room?
You've hit the nail on the head. That was the exact crisis the industry faced. Not only was the audience getting a bit fatigued by the repetitive urban plots, but Lagos itself is an incredibly congested, difficult city.
The traffic alone.
It's expensive to film there. The noise, the massive traffic jams, the crowds, it makes rapid production an absolute logistical nightmare. The industry realized that to avoid creative stagnation and to escape the nightmare of shooting in Lagos, they needed to invent a completely new cinematic landscape.
So where did they go?
They needed to look backward in time and eastward geographically.
And this geographical pivot fundamentally changes the aesthetic of Nollywood. Production began to shift heavily to the east, specifically to the city of Enugu. Now, why Enugu?
Enugu was brilliant for filmmakers for several reasons. Historically, it was a former colonial administrative center, so it was relatively peaceful, the roads were decent, and crucially, it had the oldest TV broadcasting infrastructure in the eastern region.
Oh, so the talent was already there.
Exactly. This meant there was a deep bench of retired television professionals, skilled technicians, and a lot of eager local talent. Plus, it was significantly cheaper than Lagos. The local villages surrounding the city were thrilled to have film crews arrive and eagerly participated as extras for very little money.
And this shift to Enugu gives birth to one of the most iconic Nollywood genres, the cultural epic.
A huge turning point.
The movie that really kicks the door open and defines the genre is Igbo in 1999. They poured a massive 10 million naira into this production, which was an absolute fortune for a video film at the time, and you can see every penny on screen.
The scale was unprecedented.
They spent it all on scale. Huge casts, beautiful thatched village aesthetics, traditional music, spears, warriors running through the deep forest on a cursed quest to save their village. It was a totally different visual language from the Lagos living rooms.
Igbo was a true landmark. It solidified the visual and narrative hallmarks of the genre. You suddenly have these booming archetypal figures dominating the screen. You have the Igwe, which is the traditional king, and the Dibia, the traditional priest or diviner who interprets the will of the gods.
And Pitadoki was the king of these roles.
No one embodied this epic archetype better than the actor Pitadoki. He had previously played the lead role of Okonkwo in a famous 1980s NTA adaptation of Chinua Achebe's classic novel Things Fall Apart.
So he had the gravitas.
Completely.
Right.
When he stepped into these Nollywood epics as the Igwe, he projected this ultimate, authoritative, booming patriarchy. He became the absolute face of traditional pre-colonial authority on screen.
But, and I know this drives academic film historians completely crazy, these movies were not historical documentaries. They were wildly, unapologetically anachronistic.
Oh, absolutely. The total disregard for strict historical verisimilitude is actually one of the most fascinating aspects of the genre.
Give me an example.
You would have films ostensibly set in the pre-colonial 18th or 19th century before major European contact. But the characters are speaking modern, highly idiomatic English.
Right.
The queens and princesses are wearing costumes dyed in bright synthetic neon chemical colors that absolutely did not exist back then. They're wearing modern, high-fashion silhouettes just decorated with traditional cowrie shells or motifs.
I'm sure the critics love that.
Oh, many purist critics complained bitterly that they were bastardizing African history. But that critique completely misses the point of what Nollywood was actually doing.
Yeah. Here's where it gets really interesting, because I agree completely. It reminds me of how Hollywood treats the Wild West or medieval Europe. They weren't trying to make a museum piece for a university archive. They were creating their own version of the Arthurian legend.
Exactly.
It doesn't matter if medieval knights didn't actually speak in perfect, poetic Shakespearean English or wear flawlessly shiny, impractical plate armor. It's about establishing a grand national mythology. For a generation of urbanized Nigerian youth or Nigerians living in the diaspora in London who felt disconnected from their ancestral roots, these epics created a usable past. It was a fantasy space of cultural pride and majesty.
Precisely. It was a horizon of the imagination. And because it was an imaginative space rather than a strict historical one, it was incredibly flexible.
It could evolve.
Very quickly, the hard-edged, violent historical epics involving wars and curses softened into a subgenre that became known as the royal film.
What were those like?
These were essentially Cinderella stories. You'd have a handsome prince who defies his family to fall in love with a poor commoner, or a virtuous village maiden abused by her wicked stepmother. And the whole film revolves around overcoming the rigid class structures of the palace.
So it's melodrama in costume.
Yes, it allowed all the juicy, melodramatic romance of the urban Lagos films to thrive, but safely cloaked in beautiful, traditional, regal aesthetics.
It's a brilliant storytelling hack. It allows the audience to process power dynamics, authority, and class struggle in a setting that feels distant, timeless, and safe. But while the epics were looking to the deep past, the real world of Nigeria was undergoing a massive seismic shift.
1999.
Yes, in 1999, the military dictatorship finally ended. Nigeria transitioned, albeit messily, to civilian democratic rule. And suddenly, filmmakers realized they didn't have to hide their critiques of power in the distant past or in supernatural metaphors anymore.
This brings us to a major thematic evolution in the industry. With the military out of power, the very real, visceral fear of being dragged away in the middle of the night by the state security services diminished significantly.
They could speak freely.
Filmmakers could suddenly turn their cameras directly on the political power dynamics of the immediate present. We see the birth of the explicitly political film.
And when we talk about political films in Nollywood, we really have to talk about Tunde Kailani. He is widely considered one of the most respected auteurs in the industry. He makes a film called Sabaroid, or Brass Bells, and it's just this incredibly sharp, brilliant allegory. Can you break down how this movie works?
Sabaroid is a masterpiece of political cinema. It tells the story of an ancient, fictional Yoruba community that has a deeply magical, binding constitution. When a new king is crowned, ceremonial incisions are made on his body, and a magical powder is placed in his crown and in a sacred drum.
Okay, so high-stakes magic.
The rule is this: if a corrupt king who rejects traditional checks and balances, who oppresses the people and steals their wealth, tries to wear the crown while the sacred drum is played, he will die of an excruciatingly splitting headache.
That is quite the security system.
It is. So the film follows a king who tries to cheat this system, who enlists corrupt businessmen and foreign logging companies to strip the land's resources. It is a direct, biting critique of the greedy, autocratic leaders who had been pillaging Nigeria for decades, but told through the beautiful, sophisticated lens of Yoruba tradition.
And it perfectly tackles something sociologists call the reciprocal convergence of elites, which is, well, it's a very academic way of describing something we see all over the world.
Right, the elite club.
It's the idea that the politicians, the wealthy businessmen, the military brass, and even the traditional religious rulers all interlock. They all scratch each other's backs to maintain power over the masses. It's like the Nigerian equivalent of the military-industrial complex. And Nollywood satire just relentlessly targeted this elite club.
But we have to note that the critique wasn't always just high-minded political satire. It often bled into brutal, real-world violence.
Like the Otokoto incident.
Yes. In 1996, there was a horrific, real-life scandal known as the Otokoto incident in the city of Owerri. A young boy was ritually murdered in a hotel by members of the local elite who were using his body parts for occult rituals to gain wealth.
That is just horrifying.
It is. And when the public found out, it sparked massive, violent riots. The people burned down the properties of the rich. This real-life horror completely validated and merged the old money ritual movie trope from living in bondage with urgent, real-world political critique.
The metaphor became real.
Exactly. And out of this trauma, you get the rapid rise of vigilante films.
Right, because when the police are corrupt, when the courts are bought, and the government is actively preying on you, who do you turn to? You turn to grassroots justice. You get movies reflecting the real-life Bakassi boys.
Who were a very real force.
Yeah, these were actual vigilante groups who fought violent crime with a mix of machetes, guns, and supposedly bulletproof spiritual charms. The audiences demanded these films. Because in real life, the corrupt billionaire or the evil politician almost always gets away with it. They fly to London and live in luxury.
Sad but true.
But in Nollywood, never. Due to the strict moralism demanded by the audience, the bad guys must be punished. God or the traditional spirits or the street vigilantes will absolutely strike them down. It provides the emotional closure and the justice that real life denies them.
It's an aesthetics of moral outrage. But let's be honest, it is psychologically exhausting to be constantly outraged.
There really is.
You cannot live in a state of perpetual fury at the systemic injustice of the world. And Nollywood, being so closely tied to its audience's emotional state, understood that perfectly. So, running parallel to the heavy political allegories and the bloody vigilante films, you have the comedy genre stepping in to act as a crucial, necessary pressure valve.
Yes. Think about the media you consume when you're deeply frustrated with the endless, depressing news cycle. Do you always want to watch a heavy, traumatic documentary about systemic corruption? Or do you want to see the corrupt, arrogant, out-of-touch guy slip on a banana peel and get his comeuppance in a hilarious, humiliating way?
Usually the latter.
Exactly. Enter comedic actors like Ninkum Owo.
Ninkum Owo is an absolute comedic genius. What actors like him did was strip away the heavy, life-or-death moralism of the political films. Comedies often targeted a very specific, recognizable Nigerian trope known as the Bintu.
Oh, I love this trope.
It's hilarious. This is the arrogant person who has recently returned from living abroad. They've been to London or America. They usually return with a fake, exaggerated accent. They pretend they've completely forgotten their native language and culture. They complain about the heat, and they look down on everyone in the village.
They are the absolute worst. Everyone knows someone like that. And the comedies just skewer them relentlessly. They play on the clash between the reality of the daily hustle and the fake, fragile sophistication of the elite. It's deeply satisfying.
It really is.
But while all this is happening, while the political films and the comedies are dissecting the older generation's corruption, a massive, quiet demographic shift was completely rewriting the rules of the market.
This is a crucial pivot for the industry's survival. In the late 90s, and particularly the 2000s, tertiary school enrollments in Nigeria absolutely skyrocketed. They tripled in a very short period.
Suddenly, there are students everywhere.
Yes. Suddenly, you have well over 1 million young people concentrated in universities across the country. You have a massive new, distinct youth culture. They're relatively affluent. They're away from their parents for the first time. They have their own disposable income to spend on video discs. And importantly, they demand their own stories.
They don't want the village stories.
Exactly. They don't want to watch movies about village elders or conservative family melodramas. They want movies about themselves.
And boom, the youth wave hits. The campus film explodes onto the scene. The university campus becomes this hyper-focused, autonomous universe for a whole new generation of viewers. Now, if you are listening to this and remembering your own college experience, worrying about passing final exams, joining a debate club, or paying off student loans, you have to throw that entirely out the window.
Yeah, this is not that kind of college.
The Nollywood campus isn't really about education.
Not at all. The rules of the campus in these films are incredibly specific and highly stylized. In Nollywood, the campus is depicted as a bounded, desacralized space. Think back to the older films we discussed. Cults and secret societies were always tied to dark magic, blood sacrifices, and the occult.
The money rituals.
Right. But in the campus films, the student cults are completely stripped of the supernatural. It is entirely about raw, physical power, access to money, and pure intimidation. It's about which clique controls the social hierarchy of the quad.
It is all about the face-off. This is a classic Nollywood narrative mechanic, but the campus films perfected into an art form. You have these symmetrical cliques, usually 3 or 4 friends, moving in slow motion.
Always the slow motion.
And they don't fight with magic. They meet in the courtyard, and it's just highly choreographed verbal warfare. It's intense fashion battles. Who has the sharpest insults? Who is wearing the most expensive imported clothes? Who is driving the best car?
And what's truly notable here, and a major shift for the industry, is the portrayal of women. Unlike the highly patriarchal structure of the cultural epics, where women were often subservient, these campus films feature incredibly powerful, self-directed, unapologetic female characters.
They are running the show.
They're tough, incredibly stylish, sometimes bordering on sociopathic, and they absolutely dominate the campus politics.
The ultimate iconic example of this is the movie Jenifa, starring Funke Akinde. She plays this girl from a rural village who gets to the big university and completely constructs a fake, wildly wealthy persona just to survive and dominate the social scene.
She fakes everything.
She fakes her accent, she fakes her background, she hustles to keep up the appearance of immense wealth.
It's a brilliant character study. And if we connect this to the bigger picture, the campus films show how the national psychology had shifted. They completely replaced the SAP-era anxieties of the early 90s.
How so?
Well, in Living in Bondage, the ultimate threat was literal starvation, extreme poverty, and societal collapse. But in the campus films of the 2000s, the threat isn't starving to death. The threat is losing social status.
Ah, the fear of missing out.
Exactly. It's the intense, paralyzing anxiety of losing face among your peers when young people from wildly different wealth brackets, the children of corrupt billionaires and the children of struggling civil servants, when they're suddenly mixing in one concentrated place, the cults and the cliques become a proxy for the brutal inequalities of the new neoliberal economy.
It sounds exactly like the American Mean Girls or Gossip Girl ecosystem, but with the volume turned up to 11 because the economic disparities in Nigeria are so much steeper and the stakes of failing feel so much higher. It's survival of the fiercest.
It is. And the massive success of the campus films proved that Nollywood had matured enough as an industry to cater to highly distinct, specific niches. It wasn't just throwing one broad melodrama at the entire country anymore. They knew how to target audiences.
But the biggest audience was yet to come.
Right, because the most fascinating and ultimately most lucrative niche they discovered wasn't even living in Nigeria.
Right. Here is where the story gets truly global. Because due to decades of economic instability, there were millions of Nigerians living abroad. In London, in New York, in Houston, in Atlanta. And they were desperately homesick for a connection to their culture.
And they had money.
Exactly. And crucially, they had hard currency. Dollars and pounds. Welcome to the Nollywood diaspora.
By the early 2000s, producers realized the buying power of this diaspora. There was a massive boom of films shot entirely or partially overseas. We're talking about massive, iconic hits like Osufia in London.
Starring our guy in Kemowo.
Starring our comedy king in Kemowo as a village man navigating the cold streets of the UK, or dramas like Missing in America. But the way these films were actually funded and produced, It was pure, unadulterated guerrilla Nollywood.
I really want to break down the logistics of this because it's mind-blowing.
It's so clever.
Let's say a Nollywood producer wants to shoot a movie in New York. They don't have a massive Hollywood budget. They don't have permits to shut down streets. They can't afford craft services for 50 people. So how do they do it?
Oh, indeed.
They get a tourist visa for a couple of major Lego stars. They fly them to New York with a tiny crew. And then they go to the local African grocery stores in Brooklyn, the local Nigerian hair braiding salons, the immigrant-owned restaurants, and they propose a deal.
The hustle never stops.
They say, give us some cash, feed our crew for the week, let us shoot our scenes in the aisles of your shop, and we will feature your business name prominently in the movie. It's extreme, grassroots, product placement, funding the entire international production.
It is an absolutely incredible adaptation of the informal Idumota market hustle, but projected onto a global scale. They bypass the formal banking systems entirely.
Brilliant.
But what is truly revealing about these diaspora films is the thematic focus. This raises an important question about what Nigerians actually fear when they move abroad. Because when you think about immigrants moving to a Western country, you would assume the films would be about facing white racism, or the struggle to assimilate into a new alien culture, or the classic American dream narrative.
That's usually the standard trope.
Right. But surprisingly, that is rarely the focus of these movies.
Exactly. The ultimate threat in a Nollywood diaspora film isn't the foreign culture or the racist landlord. The ultimate threat is other Nigerians. The foreign city. Whether it's the skyline of London or the highways of Houston, it is just a cold, gray, isolating backdrop. The actual drama, the profound betrayal, the heartbreak is entirely internal to the expat community.
That is the brilliant thematic inversion. The films act as these intense moral tests. The Nigerian who moves abroad and lets Western individualism and greed override their cultural loyalty. The one who betrays their friend in business or cheats on their spouse because they think the traditional rules of home no longer apply. They are severely punished by the narrative.
They always get caught.
Always. Usually they end up broke, deported, and sent back to Lagos in absolute shame. But the ones who navigate the brutal, atomized foreign landscape without losing their soul, who stay true to their community and their family, they are rewarded.
So, moving to America in a Nollywood film isn't about achieving the traditional American dream at all. It's viewed almost as a moral holiday. It's an isolated test environment where your worst impulses are suddenly free to run wild because your family and your village elders aren't there to keep you in check. It's the ultimate test of character. Let's see who you really are when nobody from home is watching.
It is a profound psychological insight into the immigrant experience, and the diaspora audience absolutely devoured these films. They were buying VHS tapes from those same grocery stores that funded the movies, then they moved to DVDs, and eventually the rise of the internet made it easier than ever to watch them.
But there's a flip side to that technology.
There is. As is always the case with rapid technological shifts, that exact technological leap almost completely destroyed the industry.
Which brings us to our final act, New Nollywood and the digital era. Because around 2007, the wheels of this incredible informal machine almost totally fall off. What exactly caused the crash?
It was a perfect storm of factors, starting with a massive crisis of overproduction. The barrier to entry had become so incredibly low. Anyone with a cheap digital camera could make a movie. So in a single year, 2007, the industry officially released roughly 2,700 films.
That is more than 7 feature films a day.
The market was completely saturated. The Idumota marketers couldn't make a profit because there was just too much product and the average quality had plummeted.
And hitting at the exact same time was the rise of satellite TV across Africa, specifically the Africa Magic channels on the DSTV network. They were broadcasting older Nollywood movies 204/7 across the entire continent.
Free content everywhere.
Plus, you had the explosion of early internet piracy and cheap digital copying. People were burning VCDs and DVDs on their home computers for pennies. So if you are a fan, why would you go to the chaotic market and pay full price for a legitimate disc when you can watch a movie for free on satellite TV or buy a pirated copy on the street corner for next to nothing?
You wouldn't.
Exactly. The physical disc sales, which were the absolute lifeblood of the marketers who funded the whole system, just cratered.
This existential threat forced a massive structural evolution within the industry. Independent filmmakers, especially the younger, foreign-educated directors who had always chafed under the creative control of the market traders, saw an opportunity to bypass the old system entirely.
A new path.
At this exact time in Nigeria, a new middle class was emerging. An upscale, Air-conditioned multiplex cinemas began being built in massive new shopping malls in major cities like Lagos and Abuja. The independent filmmakers decided to target these multiplexes instead of the street markets. This pivot is the birth of what is termed New Nollywood.
And we're talking a total visual and qualitative upgrade. To justify a cinema ticket price, filmmakers start moving away from the cheap, flat look of digital video and actually return to shooting on high-quality 35mm celluloid or high-end R-rated digital cameras.
They looked stunning.
You have gorgeous, high-budget, slickly edited films like Tango with Me or EJ. E was actually shot partially in Los Angeles with real Hollywood production values. They aren't just dropping VHS tapes in shops anymore. They are doing massive, glamorous, red carpet theatrical premieres.
The whole Hollywood treatment.
They are actively pursuing the diasporic box office, holding massive premieres at places like the famous Odeon Cinema in Leicester Square in London, drawing crowds that rivaled Hollywood blockbusters.
And crucially, the internet technology that almost destroyed them with piracy eventually provided a lifeline.
YouTube to the rescue.
Yeah, when YouTube introduced its Content ID software, it finally gave Nigerian producers a weapon against the digital pirates. If a fan uploaded a pirated copy of a new movie to YouTube, the software would flag it. And the producer could choose to either take it down or monetize it, to run ads on it and collect the revenue themselves.
That is a game changer.
It stabilized the digital Wild West and paved the way for dedicated, massive streaming giants. Companies like IRCO TV emerged, which became known as the Netflix of Africa. They started buying legitimate digital rights, aggregating the content, and funneling real, reliable money back to the creators, completely cutting out the DVD pirates.
Okay, I have to stop you there and play devil's advocate for a second.
Go ahead.
If this new generation of filmmakers is making glossy 35mm Hollywood-style movies and charging $10 or $15 a ticket at an upscale multiplex in a fancy gated shopping mall, aren't they totally alienating the millions of working-class fans who built Nollywood in the first place?
This is a very valid concern.
The people sitting in the hot, crowded video parlors and the market stalls who made living in Bondage a hit, it feels like the industry is gentrifying its own audience and leaving its roots behind.
You are absolutely right to point that out, and it is arguably the central, unresolved tension of the Nigerian film industry today. The multiplexes are completely out of reach for the vast majority of everyday Nigerians. The ticket prices are simply too high.
So what happens to them?
Well, the veteran filmmakers, the true auteurs like Tuni Kilani, who we discussed earlier, are acutely aware of this cultural loss. Kilani has been actively trying to bridge this gap. He's been advocating for and trying to build a revival of community cinemas.
Like local viewing centers.
Accessible places where ordinary people can gather to watch high-quality films in their own local languages, stories deeply rooted in their own literature and culture, without paying exorbitant multiplex prices. The goal is to keep the deep grassroots cultural connection alive, even as the production values soar and the global reach of the industry expands onto platforms like Netflix and Amazon.
It's a fascinating tightrope to walk. So what does this all mean? Let's take a breath and look at the whole arc of what we've covered today.
It's quite the journey.
We have tracked a journey that is, frankly, miraculous. Nollywood started with a bunch of unemployed TV creatives and street-smart electronics dealers selling shrink-wrapped VHS tapes out of the trunks of their cars in the middle of a brutal military dictatorship and a collapsed economy.
Against all odds.
They used whatever was lying around. They filmed in their own living rooms. They made up the rules as they went. And through sheer, relentless, informal hustle, they built a digitally streamed, globally recognized cinematic powerhouse that refused to let Hollywood or European art house directors or anyone else tell Africa's stories. They demanded to see their own faces, their own wealth, their own fears, and their own gods on screen.
It truly is the ultimate triumph of popular art over formal structure. It is an industry that succeeded against all logical odds, precisely because it stayed so incredibly close to the emotional, spiritual, and economic realities of its audience. It didn't talk down to them, it reflected them perfectly.
But I want to leave you, the listener, with a final, lingering thought to mull over. We've seen how Nollywood's unique magic, its wild energy, its bizarre historical anachronisms, its raw, unpolished emotional power, all of that was forged precisely in the fires of chaos, of piracy, and of a completely unregulated street-level hustle.
The hustle was the magic.
Now, as the industry becomes increasingly formalized, as it gets corporate backing, massive global streaming deals, and gets polished up for the elite multiplexes and international award shows, will it lose that raw grassroots authenticity? When you finally build the perfect, shiny Hollywood-style studio in Lagos, do you accidentally lock out the hungry street hawker with a brilliant, culturally defining story who just wanted to grab a camera and change the world?
It's the eternal question of success, isn't it?
Yeah.
How do you scale the hustle without losing its soul?
Exactly. Keep asking those questions, keep looking past the glossy promotional posters, and keep exploring the hidden, chaotic histories of the media you consume. The real story is usually happening behind the camera. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive into the sources, and we'll see you next time.